Hey everyone, welcome to Localism, the podcast that asks if we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your host and Waffle House aficionado, Blunchley. I take my hash browns chunked, diced, and capped. Thank you very much. Drop your own Waffle House order in the comments if you're so inclined. Anyway, we aren't here to talk about Waffle House, at least not directly, as much as that I wish that was the case. We're here to get into a very topical and unfortunately kind of fucking depressing topic: organized labor. We'll start by getting into a very quick crash course in the background of how organized labor works under American law and the history of how that system was set up. From there, we'll move into taking stock of how the systems of law are holding up in modern times. And finally, we'll think about whether that system's more or less total dysfunction is something that could be ameliorated via localism. Now, even for a veteran yapper like myself, I have a lot to yap about when it comes to this subject. This is also the reason that this episode is so delayed. I had to take an extra week to do research into what I thought was going to initially be a pretty straightforward and easy to talk about topic. Because there's so much content, I don't really know how long this episode is going to go on for. It may end up being longer than the normal episode, so strap in, get ready for the ride, and get ready for a lot of talking about federal agency acronyms. Woo, I love acronyms. Anyway, let's jump right in. Okay, surprise, I kind of lied. We're actually not going to start with the history of American organized labor and American labor law. Instead, we're going to start by talking about politics, specifically modern political approval. And that's because some of you might have come into this episode thinking, organized labor, you mean like unions and stuff? Why should we care about that? In fact, by the numbers, if you're listening to this right now, you are significantly more likely than not to have absolutely zero connection to unions at all. Maybe your parent or grandparents were in one, but you are statistically very unlikely to have ever been in one yourself. I mean, let's just take a look at the numbers. At the time of writing, less than 10% of people in the workforce are in a union. This arguably is actually overselling the average unionization rate. This percentage is driven by state and federal public employees who represent only 15% of the total workforce, but are unionized at a rate of 32%. Meanwhile, in the private sector, which accounts for an overwhelming majority of American jobs, the unionization rate stands at an absolutely anemic 6%. And things just kind of keep getting worse. Union participation has been trending down for literal decades. We peaked at around 35% in the post-World War II years, slumped down to 20% by the 80s, and have petered out ever since. The reasons why are complicated, but anyone looking at the numbers would tend to think that we're on a slow but steady path to unions and organized labor generally becoming an increasingly irrelevant force in the American economic, political, and social sphere. Given this, it may or may not surprise you to learn that organized labor and the concept of unionization is actually having something of a renaissance, at least in the hearts and minds of Americans, if not actually on shop floors. There has been some really fascinating research done lately about approval rates for unions and the concept of unionization, which in the past 5 years has surged to nearly 65%. That's 2 in 3 Americans. It's pretty damn hard to find many things that you can get 2 in 3 Americans to agree upon, especially in these particular times. Furthermore, an interesting aspect of this heightened approval level is the way in which this general approval and perspective of desirability has begun to stretch across party lines. Traditionally, unions are seen as falling into the camp of left-wing advocates, while being opposed by a right-wing pro-business and anti-regulation Republican Party. Certainly, labor unions have a long, though not completely exclusive history of being left-aligned. But that has really started to change in America in the past decade or so. American Compass, a conservative think tank that advised on Project 2025, so not exactly a bunch of bleeding heart liberals, performed an admittedly very limited survey, only around 1,000 people, of voters across the political spectrum to gauge their views of unionization. The results, though limited in their statistical usefulness, were fascinating. As expected, about 80% of Dems viewed unions favorably. But there were also more Republicans who viewed unions favorably than there were Republicans who viewed unions unfavorably, 46% versus 38%. The rest expressed a neutral view. And this overall average favorability percentage actually disguised a super interesting generational divide for Republicans on this issue. If you're an older Republican, you're actually more likely than not to disapprove of labor unions. But younger Republicans, the Gen Z MAGA types that the right takes pride in and who are sort of forming the back of the new MAGA generation, instead approved of unions at a rate of 60%. In other words, the up-and-coming backbone of the Republican Party views unionization in a much more positive light than the traditional conservatives we're more used to. When we step back and think about this, it may not actually be all that surprising that people, and especially young people from both sides of the political aisle, are beginning to view organized labor as more important. For the dirty lefty libs like myself, unions are desirable for their traditional association with left-wing movements, and their ability to challenge a capitalistic system that often favors profit for fat cats at the expense of ordinary people's wages, safety, and well-being. Traditional conservatives, who would tend to see unions as a drag on the productivity of the American economy and embodying an unwanted ethic of collectivism rather than individualism, don't have many reasons to find unions attractive. But this ain't exactly the era of the traditional conservative, is it? No, right now we live in the time of MAGA. And MAGA is, if nothing else, an unusual bundle of conservative positions that includes no small amount of economic populism that harmonizes surprisingly comfortably with organized labor. Get rid of NAFTA and other quote-unquote free market efforts that offshore jobs, tariff foreign commerce in the name of encouraging American economic and especially American industrial activity. Shit, that's practically the AFL-CIO's wish list. So unions and MAGA conservatives have their political interests aligned in at least some respects. But there's more going on under the hood here too. If we take a look at the stats for union members in 2024 from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it turns out that most union workers are white. Now, to be clear here, the way the numbers work out, it's not actually the case that white people are more likely to be in a union than other racial groups. By this, I mean, for example, around 15% of black workers are in a union, compared to only about 12% of white workers. The numbers are around 11% for Asian and Hispanic workers, but because there's a lot more white people running around in America than there are for other races or ethnicities, it turns out that 12% of white workers represents a much bigger number than, say, 10% of all Asian workers. All this is to say that there are a lot of white union members. Union jobs tend to be, though by no means always are, working class jobs. And if you look at voting results, white working class voters break overwhelmingly in favor of Republicans. Well, not just any Republicans. They specifically break for one kind of Republican in particular, Trump and the movement he represents. As recently as the first decade in the 2000s, white working class voters were by no means the Republican monolith they have become in modern times. From Reagan through Romney, white working class voters split about evenly between the left and the right. But each time that Trump was on the ballot, 60% or more of white working class voters supported him. And that means a pretty decent chunk. There is some debate over the exact amount, but no one can deny a pretty decent chunk of unionized workers must have broke for Trump too. This explains stuff like the Teamsters declining to endorse Harris and Trump flirting with unions as a potential base of support. The point is that a higher number of union members than you might think are Republican, and it turns out that people who are in a union tend to think that unions are useful and they'd like their politicians to support organized labor. Again, not always the case. I'm sure there are plenty of people in organized shops that hate unions' guts precisely because they're in organized shops. But if you're in a union, you probably tend to like unions. And people in unions are breaking for Trump in a way that hasn't really happened in modern conservative history. Stepping away from the numbers and into the touchy-feely realm for a bit, think about the label for the modern conservative movement, MAGA, Make America Great Again. In other words, return America to the state it used to be in, a prior and nostalgic and more desirable time. And what are the characteristics of that time? When one main breadwinner could go out and work a job that didn't require an expensive college degree, and provide for family and buy a house and probably have a pension too? Well, that sounds a lot like an industrial union job. Indeed, the era that these MAGA conservatives have the most nostalgia for, the baby boomer 50s to 60s era, happens to coincide with the time in American history where the highest percentage of American workers were unionized. Even the second most nostalgic period, the 80s, which was definitely marked by pretty significant anti-union sentiment as expressed through stuff like Reagan's firing of the air traffic controllers, nevertheless still had a unionization rate 2 to 3 times higher than the rate today. In short, when MAGA people are talking about bringing us back to a time when America was great, they're talking about a time where unions played a much greater role in society and the economy. and there's a growing minority of people on the right who are starting to warm up to that connection. Finally, no matter what side of the modern political aisle you're on, everybody likes a higher paycheck, and here the data speaks for itself. Although there is some disagreement in the data, the consensus is that people who work a job that's unionized tend to make about 10% more than people who are working the same job in a non-unionized workplace. Not a hard and fast rule, but in general, people in a union are getting paid higher wages. At a time where affordability is an issue that everybody is worried about, blue, red, black, or white, we all have to put food on the table, a 10% raise is an eye-opener, for sure. All I'm trying to give into here is that the question of unions and organized labor is something that's live, contemporary, and important, even if unionization numbers are in a freefall. In fact, that's exactly why the topic is so important. Organized labor is seeing expanded support, including from parts of the political spectrum and from populations that you wouldn't expect. But for whatever reason, that isn't translating into actual unionization rates increasing or new union contracts. So it is worthwhile to stop and think and ponder whether the legal systems surrounding organized labor in America are functioning well. Even more basically, this shit's important, and it's become more important all of a sudden, so, let's weigh whether the feds are doing a good job of managing all the stuff around it. Before I can, you guessed it, talk mad shit about the federal apparatus that surrounds organized labor and suggest that localism has a better solution than even certain state systems that have been set up, I first need to describe what exactly that federal apparatus and also state apparatus where appropriate is. And hoo boy, let me tell you, that is a job and a half in and of itself. Stick with me, folks, we're about to get super deep into the weeds here. To massively oversimplify a complicated area, there are basically 4 categories or types of unions. The first is railroad and airline unions. The second is what I'm going to call NLRA unions, which is pretty much all unions in the private sector that aren't in the railroad or airline or agricultural or quote-unquote domestic servant field. The third is public sector unions, and public sector unions are technically themselves broken up into 2 subcategories of unions, which are federal worker unions and state worker unions. Lastly, we have what I'm calling state law private sector unions, which are unions covering parts of the private sector that are excluded from federal law. Yes, I know that lots of state public worker unions are also created under state law, but just trust me, it makes sense to talk about state public worker unions and state law private sector unions separately for reasons that we will get into later. To make matters even worse, workers' rights and what unions are allowed to do can vary super widely depending on which of these fun little categories you happen to fit into. So does the process you have to undergo if your rights get violated or if you want to bring a union into your workplace. Always a good start when the question of, hey, how does this union stuff work anyway, needs to be answered with like a fucking collapsing option tree of an answer, but that's showbiz, baby. We'll go through each of these little categories of unions and union law in order to try and explain how they all fit together. We'll start with the railway and airline unions. Not because they're the biggest. Quite the opposite. My guess, though I admit I don't have a number for this, is that unionized railway and airline workers actually make up a pretty small portion of American unionized workers. Now, we're starting with them because the law that railway and airline unions are organized under is the first and oldest of the relevant federal laws that make up the current American organized labor landscape. Let me set the scene for you. It's the late 19th and early 20th century. You know what's really fucking important to America during those times? That's right, trains. They're how you transport men and materials to fuel America's expanding industrial base. They're the fastest and most comfortable way to travel from point A to point B. It's not much of an exaggeration to say that, at this time, railroads were America's lifeblood. This meant 2 things. First, the people who own the railroads are making a shit ton of money, and they aren't too keen on the idea of sharing that money by paying their workers $1 more than necessary. Second, if something happens to disrupt the railroads and keep them from working, say some kind of, labor strike, then things are going to get really bad really fast for maybe like the entire American economy. So for a long time, America faced these super disruptive and super violent waves of railroad labor unrest, where you had workers going on strike and then state militia or even federal military forces coming in to break the strikes. This includes stuff like the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and the Pullman Strike in 1894. Workers weren't happy because they didn't really enjoy getting shot while striking. Business interests weren't happy because all of this blood and work stoppage was really reducing productivity. So, after a few fits and starts of figuring out a federal level labor law and a brief period where the railroads were nationalized because of World War I, business and labor and political interests got together to pass a law that would actually stick around, the Railway Labor Act of 1926, which I'll be calling the RLA from now on. The way that unions and organizing work under the RLA is probably pretty different than the picture you have in your head about union stuff. Let's begin with policy. What were the talking heads trying to do when they passed the RLA? In theory, it was a meeting of the minds of industry and government and labor, and what resulted was a compromise that represented everyone's interests. In practice, the politicians were really mostly worried about one thing. How do we keep the trains running? How do we keep the economy from shitting itself because some rail workers in the Chicago West Side rail yards refuse to work? And what's the bare minimum of crumbs we can throw to labor to make it so that it's in their best interest to observe and respect whatever law we pass? The objective was very much not, oh wow, we want to respect the dignity and safety of the American worker. No, it was all about keeping those trains rolling and avoiding economic disruption. Given this policy, it makes sense who the RLA covers, which is employees of railroads. Who would have guessed? An interesting little asterisk here is that unlike other categories of organized labor we'll be getting into shortly, the RLA actually allows certain low-level supervisors to be represented by unions as well. So maybe you and your immediate supervisor could be in the same unit and union. Though under the RLA and pretty much all other federal labor laws, high-level supervisors or management officials aren't allowed to be represented by unions under the theory that this creates divided loyalties or imposes too much control over a private business or whatever. Basically, if you're too high up the chain of command, you don't get to be in a union. And that's true no matter what area of organized labor you're in or what federal law you're governed by. Aside from this quirk about allowing some supervisors to be part of unions, another super unique feature of the RLA is that it creates a system of craft unions. What's a craft union, you might ask? Basically, a craft union system is one where there's one nationwide union and one nationwide collective bargaining agreement that everybody within a certain trade or role within an industry belongs to. For the RLA, that means that there's one union for engineers, one for conductors, one for signalmen, and etc., etc. If you're an engineer in Nebraska, you're part of the same union that also represents an engineer in New York. The RLA's craft union system contrasts it with another kind of unit division you might have heard about called sectoral bargaining. Under sectoral bargaining, unions represent specific entire fields or areas within the economy. For example, there might be a single national fast food workers union, a car mechanics union, a miners union, and so on and so forth. You might have heard of sectoral bargaining mentioned as something that's more common in Europe. Sectoral bargaining may sound kind of similar to craft unions, and they are kind of similar, but here's the key difference. In sectoral bargaining, everybody within a particular industry is represented by the same union and same contract. Doesn't matter what your particular job title is within that industry, only that you're in the right industry. So if we assume some kind of hypothetical sectoral contract for all restaurant workers, then everybody within a restaurant would be covered by the same collective bargaining agreement, regardless of whether you're a cook or a server or a greeter or a dishwasher or whatever. And that'd be true nationwide. It'd be the same union for the workers no matter what restaurant you'd walk into. Now, under a craft union system, it's still the case that there would be these unions that represent all workers in all restaurants across the nation. The key difference is that there'd be one union for the cooks, and one for the waiters, and one for the dishwashers, and a separate contract for each. The RLA creates that system of one contract and one union each for the cooks and the waiters and dishwashers. And just to make things even more confusing, there is a third type of union organization called enterprise bargaining. Enterprise bargaining is probably the form you're most familiar with. Under enterprise bargaining, instead of having the nationwide unions that are present in sectoral and craft systems, there's a separate contract for each particular workplace. So if, say, you work in a widget factory in Ohio owned by company X, and your uncle does the exact same job in another widget factory next door that's owned by company Y, then under an enterprise bargaining system, you and your uncle would be covered by two separate collective bargaining agreements. Your uncle's labor representative would bargain with company Y, and your labor representative would bargain with company X, even though the two of you are doing the exact same job in the exact same industry. Even more confusingly, this doesn't necessarily mean that you and your uncle are in different unions. It could be that the same union represents a unit of widget makers in company X's factory and another unit in company Y's factory. Or it could be that there's one union that represents the company X people and a totally different one that represents the company Y people. But the defining characteristic of enterprise bargaining is that you have to organize on a shop-by-shop, company-by-company basis rather than on a nationwide craft or nationwide industry basis. We'll get into an American labor law that sets out a system of enterprise bargaining shortly. But for now, back to the RLA. How does a unit get organized under the RLA? How do you go from a non-unionized workplace to a unionized workplace, or vice versa? To begin, the RLA creates this federal agency called the National Mediation Board, or NMB. The NMB is in charge of a few things when it comes to RLA unions, and one of those responsibilities is conducting union elections. A union election is where all the workers who could be represented by a union cast the votes on whether they want to unionize or not. If a majority of workers vote yes, then from that point on, the union is in place. If there's a tie or more workers vote against having a union, then the union gets sent packing. The NMB administers these elections. But getting it to the point of holding an election isn't as easy as just thinking to yourself one day, it sure would be nice if we had a union around here, and then calling the NMB. No, first you have to prove to the NMB that this is something that people in your shop, which because of the craft union nature of the RLA means everybody who works your job across the entire country, is actually interested in. And the way you prove this is by submitting an application with a sufficient showing of interest. What's a showing of interest? The showing of interest is the percentage of people who have signed these things called authorization cards, which are basically these little cards that have your signature and say something along the lines of, yes, please, I would like to have a union. They might also say, yes, I would like to no longer have a union, or yes, I would like to have a different union. The procedures and showing of interest requirements for an NMB election are the same, I believe, regardless of whether a particular craft union is trying to unionize, stop being represented by a union, or be represented by a different union. So if the showing of interest is a required percentage of these little cards that you have to get people in your craft to sign, how many cards do you need? Well, a shit ton. Just to be able to submit that application for an election, you need to be able to have a showing of interest of 50% of the potential units seeking unionization or decertification or a change in labor representative. That means you have to get literally half of all the people who do your job nationwide to sign your cards. Not easy. And you have to do this within a year, because any card that's signed a year before a representation application is considered void. This is a tough ask even for big nationwide unions with dues in their pockets and lawyers on retainer to walk them through this process. Imagine if you're trying to decertify and you're having to figure out how to get in touch with hundreds or thousands of people nationwide to convince them to sign cards. But fine, sure, assume you managed to get over this, teeny tiny little hurdle of getting 1,000-odd people from California to Florida to sign your little cards and submit your application. Then you have to sit around as the NMB's big old federal agency gears grind until finally you get your election. Here's how that election works. Until somewhat recently, the NMB actually held elections electronically and let people submit votes by telephone or internet, but they recently gave that up in favor of physically mailing ballots to everybody in the craft unit through, the USPS. This works about as well as you'd expect. It's slow as shit, ballots get lost, some ballots don't get counted because they arrive back at NMB HQ in Washington, D.C., too late to be counted. The whole process takes several weeks. But let's say, hey, you and your plucky union buddies managed to make it happen, and when the ballots are counted and the results announced, more people voted for the union than against it. You won. Happily off into the sunset, right? Well, maybe. Or maybe the railroads don't like the idea of having to bargain with a new union. Maybe they get into their bag of tricks to either challenge the election in the courts or find other ways to delay. We're actually going to skip over the question of how do companies and unions rat-fuck workers through procedure in the courts for now and come back to it much later, because it's going to be part of a broader conversation about the factors that are just killing organized labor in this current legal environment. Same with other categories of unions we're going to explain. No discussing how their processes are being abused or just aren't functioning well for now. At the moment, we're simply trying to sketch out the basic picture of the procedures for unionizing or decertification in an ideal world of sunshine and roses, which still manages to somehow be pretty shitty just by virtue of sheer complexity. Okay, so you won the election, the NMB certified the results, next up comes bargaining. The union and the railroads will sit down at the negotiation table and hash out a contract, a collective bargaining agreement that covers stuff like what your hours will be and how much you'll get paid and what kind of benefits you'll have. This work-related stuff is sometimes called your terms and conditions of employment. Assuming that the two sides get to an agreement, the union and the railroad sign the contract, and hopefully you and your fellow workers come out the other side better off than you were pre-contract, which is not a guarantee. By the way, a key part of all this stuff is that railroads can't just fire somebody just because they support unionizing. That's a total violation of the RLA, and it would also be a violation of the other labor statutes we're about to talk about, both federal and state. No, the carriers have to let you try and unionize and not punish you for it, assuming you're a sufficiently low-level worker or supervisor. If you're too high up, then you're not protected by the RLA and thus could be fired at a railroad's whim for so much as uttering the word union. If you get fired for supporting unionization, otherwise your employer punishes you for being pro-union, then you can file a lawsuit with the NMB, and if you win, your employer has to take back whatever negative action they took towards you. If they fired you or denied you promotion, that means giving you your proper job back and paying you any lost wages you would have received minus the unlawful action. Same also goes for people who are anti-union. If you get fired just because your employer really likes unions for some reason and doesn't like the fact that you're anti-union, that's not allowed, and the RLA will protect you. You are free to hold whatever union opinion you want, and by federal law, your employer can't retaliate against you for that opinion. That's under the RLA. That's also under other laws we're going to discuss in a little bit. Don't get me wrong, this is a legitimately powerful protection. It's certainly something that a lot of people back in the day would have been very happy to have. But this kind of protection only has teeth if the NMB, the enforcer, is able to hear cases and hand down judgments in a timely manner. So does it? Well, like I said, put a pin in all that process stuff for now. We'll be coming back to it later, along with the process problems with all the other labor agencies. So that's most of the piece of the RLA union equation, who it covers and how the workers in the right professional fields can get unionized. Now we come to the last piece, what the RLA allows workers and unions to do to pressure their employers into improving their working conditions or agreeing to a particular provision in a contract. And by this, I don't mean when unions are allowed to go to the feds with a lawsuit in hand. No. What kind of pressure can the unions provide of their own accord? And by pressure, I really mean when can the unions and the workers use the most powerful tools potentially at their disposal, picketing and going on strike. And given that the RLA's goal is less worker power than it is trying to keep the trains running on time and the 20th century American economy from exploding, how will that translate into the things it does and does not allow railway workers and their unions to do to protect their rights? What kind of legal system is at play here? Answer one that makes it super easy for daddy federal government to swoop in and take control at the first whiff of any sign of labor strife. To start off with, suppose we haven't even gotten to the strike stage yet. Let's say that the two sides, management and the unions, are arguing about a term in a collective bargaining agreement, for example, pay. And it's looking like, as it so often does, that pay is becoming a sticking point. Well, either the union or the carriers can request to submit the issue to the NMB for binding mediation. That's either party. They don't have to agree. If one side or the other says this is getting mediated, it's getting mediated. And the NMB mediator is a federal official who is going to say, okay, here's what I think is fair and what you two sides should agree on. Already the ability to require parties to submit to mediation and then suggest substantive provisions in a collective bargaining agreement gives the feds a greater degree of control of what's going on in RLA land. But let's say the parties enter mediation and the mediator makes a recommendation and the parties don't agree to that recommendation. Well, the feds don't just go, okay, geez, guess you guys are going to get to go back to arguing and unions, you can start going on strike now. No. Instead, the parties enter what's called the 30-day cooling off period. This is basically a period where the feds are saying, okay, you guys have 30 more days to try and mediate this stuff, and we heavily recommend that you come to an agreement. Mediation tends to get really serious and intense during this period as the parties come back to the table for this last-ditch attempt to try and figure things out. Why do I call this cooling off period the last chance attempt? Because in theory, after the cooling off period is over, the parties then finally can engage in self-help. Self-help here is just a term of art for shit can hit the fan. The union finally is allowed to go on strike after jumping through all these hoops and procedures. The carriers can implement whatever last and best offer they made at the bargaining table and can permanently replace but not fire strikers, or can choose to just shut down their operations and lock everybody out so nobody gets to work and nobody gets paid. Both sides get to go for their nuclear options, so to say, and both sides' nuclear options involve shutting down the railroad and making it so it's not functioning. Now remember, we only got here after the feds got to slow things down already with mediation and even try to get the parties to agree. So already we're pretty removed from labor strife at will. You got to go through this whole mediation process. But there's a reason that I said management and the union get to do all this shit in theory, and that's because the RLA provides an insanely strong mechanism for the feds to make sure that things never reach that carriers versus unions post-cooling off all-out war stage. Under the RLA, at any point during the cooling off period, the NMB can notify the president, that's like the president of the United States, that in the NMB's judgment, the carriers and the unions aren't going to be able to work things out at the mediation table, and that if they get into the tit-for-tat striking situation, it's going to significantly fuck with the national economy. Once the president gets this notice, the president doesn't have to, but can, at the president's discretion, convene something called a Presidential Emergency Board, or a PEB, which is composed of officials the president chooses. The PEB has 30 days to develop a proposal regarding the stuff the union and the carriers are disagreeing on. After that proposal is delivered, if either party's like, nah, still not convinced, then there is another 30-day cooling off period. So this is already you had to submit to mandatory mediation if the other side wanted to do it, and then you got to do the mediation. And then if the mediation isn't working, then you get into the cooling off period. And then during the cooling off period, the NMB is going to send something to the president. The president's going to make you try and figure out stuff again. And now we have hit the second cooling off period. Now, because the proposal the PEB delivers is basically going to be the president's proposal, he chose the people that were going to be on the PEB, and you bet your ass he's going to have pretty good control over what they decide should be the solution to you and the carrier's problems. If you say, no, we don't really like the PEB's proposal, then the president's going to be pissed, and this might have political consequences for your union and your chances of getting what you want at the bargaining table. But sure, let's say you're brave and spit in the president's face and say, sorry, the knives are out. If we don't get what we want, we're going on strike. Well, then after the 60 days of the PEB making a proposal and then you rejecting it and going through your second 30-day cooling off period, then at last you have made it to the promised land of risking your jobs and your livelihood by going on strike to give teeth to your demands at the bargaining table. Except just kidding once again. Sorry, you thought the RLA was just going to let you use the strongest tool in labor's box, just going to protect a right to strike after, this insanely convoluted process? Think again, bucko. The PEB isn't the nastiest way the RLA allows the feds to fuck around with railroad unions. That's because under the RLA, if the parties reject the proposal put forward by the PEB, Congress is permitted to simply impose contract terms on the parties by passing legislation. You heard that right. If you and your RLA union think your pay is bullshit and that you don't get enough leave, and you go to your boss and say, give us this stuff or we go on strike, then after waiting around for fucking ages for the NB's gears to grind, the end result can just be the federal Congress, who are no strangers to campaign donations from big companies, including railroads, passing a law that says, fuck you, go back to work with the benefits you had before, and if you strike, we're sending in the troops. I cannot emphasize enough that the RLA sets out a system of organized labor for railroad and airline workers where, at bottom, the president and Congress can pretty much just come in and tell you to stuff all your inconvenient requests for fair pay or whatever and go back to work like good little worker ants. Now, some of you might be saying, wait a minute, but maybe that's true for companies too. Surely companies must be looking at the scheme and going, oh, damn. If the president and Congress are pro-labor, then that means the feds are just going to come in here and give the union whatever they want. Surely this cuts both ways, right? Surely if we had, an administration headed by someone calling himself, quote, the most pro-labor president in history, then we'd see these mechanisms being used in favor of organized labor, right? Well, we had an excellent example of how the federal government can come wading into RLA labor disputes not all that long ago. You might remember that back in 2022, there was some stuff in the news about a potential upcoming railroad workers strike that was going to really screw up the economy, and then that strike never happened. As it happens, that situation was just exactly what we've been describing here. In 2019, railways and multiple RLA unions started negotiating over a ton of different terms and conditions of employment, including pay, benefits, and schedules. Fully 3 years later, in February 2022, should give you a sense of how drawn out this shit gets, the unions had gone to the NMB and requested mediation, likely calculating that because the NMB was at that time headed by Biden appointees, it was going to be favorable to what unions were demanding at the bargaining table. By July 2022, the NMB had notified the president that mediation was not going to work, and that a strike would be very bad for interstate commerce, so Biden convened a presidential emergency board, which came out with a proposal that did have some gains for rail workers, but also did not include something that the rail workers had dared to demand. Paid sick leave. What fucking leeches, right? Daring to ask for paid sick leave when you're the workers who literally keep most of the American economy flowing by making sure that goods can get from point A to point B. Anyway, the unions went back to the membership, and some of the unions said, the PEB's proposal does give us a 24% raise and a bonus too, that's good enough. And the membership of those unions voted to ratify a contract that accorded with the PEB's proposal. Before unions did not. They said, sorry, we gotta have that paid sick leave and some other stuff that the PEB didn't include. And so they rejected the PEB's proposal and threatened to go on strike once the PEB cooling off period was over. That put the ball in Congress's court. Since the unions have rejected the PEB's proposal, the RLA gives Congress the power to come in and just pass a law that says, okay, here's what the terms are going to be for your contract, now get back to work. In December 2022, the midterms had just ended, and the House had switched over control from Dems to Republicans. But the railroads' chances that Congress would come out with something they liked still weren't super great. For one, the Senate was controlled by the Dems, at least in theory, because the silly independents that caucus with Dems, when convenient, were the ones getting Dems over 51 votes. And for another, we had Mr. Joseph R. Biden, the man who pledged to be the most pro-union president, leading the most pro-union administration in American history in office. And if Congress passed legislation implementing a deal that didn't go along with what the unions wanted, Biden could just veto that law and allow the unions to strike. So what happened? Well, in November, the House passed a contract that actually accorded with the PEB's proposal while also giving the unions the sick leave they wanted. Neat. But then things got a little fucky, and somehow, wow, how strange, the Senate passed a version that stripped the sick leave out. And then the House folded and also signed on to this proposal. And that version of the bill is the one that made it to Biden's desk. And what did Mr. Pro-Labor do? He signed it, right away. With the mea culpa, of course. Oh, the economic effects would be devastating if a strike happened. Congress would never pass a version with sick leave, never mind that the House actually had passed that version. The nominally Democrat-controlled Senate was the one that shot it down. Sorry, rail workers, no paid sick leave for you. Back to work, or else. Now, as a lefty myself, I've certainly got my opinions about why the president didn't just say, I'm not signing shit unless it gives the people who keep our economy afloat the sick leave they want, and then dare Congress to defy him. But putting that aside, the 2022 events show that even when it's an outwardly very pro-union person at the helm of the RLA's governmental levers of power, the RLA's effect is often just to crush striking chances for unions and give the carriers what they want. Remember, again, the RLA is not about preserving the dignity of the American worker. It's about keeping those damn trains running and the dollars flowing. In summary, before an RLA union can think about striking, it has to go through the following process. First, it has to let the carriers know it wants to negotiate over some term and condition of employment like pay or hours. Then the parties have to sit down to talk about it. Then the mess is going to end up in federal mediation, either because the carrier requested on the theory that the end-up-being mediator won't agree to the union's demands, or because the union requested on the theory that the mediator will tell the carriers to give way on what the union wants. Then the union has to sit through the mediation process and wait for the mediator. Maybe the parties get to an agreement, or maybe they don't. Assuming they don't, then the cooling off period starts. Best case scenario, you have to sit around and wait for 30 more days before finally getting to strike while staring down the barrel of the carriers simply shutting down operations or legally and permanently replacing the striking workers. Worst case scenario, the federal government goes Avon Barksdale style, calls in the president, forms a PEB for more negotiations and more mediation. If the PEB then comes back with something that the union finds unacceptable, well, too fucking bad. If you reject that shitty PEB mediation result, then Congress can just swoop in and impose contract terms on you, end the controversy before you even get a chance to flex your striking muscles. And by the way, because I didn't mention it before, let's say some of your union members go, fuck the RLA, let's just go on strike anyway? Yeah. Then you lose all the protection of the RLA. The carriers can just go, okay, we're firing every single person involved in the strike, and can also go get a federal court to issue a decision in joining your strike. And if you ignore that federal injunction, well, that's when the police and the National Guard and the guns and the batons come out again, like the old days in the 1800s. Yeah, like I said, the RLA is all about keeping the trains running. It's literally designed to prevent strikes from occurring, and thus designed to prevent RLA unions from using their strongest potential tool. To finish off our discussion of RLA unions, here's a few quirks to note. First, under the RLA, collective bargaining agreements don't actually have expiration dates. In theory, the terms of a contract could just go on forever and ever. But the parties can choose to revisit the terms of a contract during certain so-called reopener dates. While the parties are negotiated, the terms of the current contract remain in place. Second, you might remember that at the beginning, when discussing what categories of workers fall under the RLA, I didn't just say railroad workers. I also said airline workers. And that's correct. People who work for air carriers are subject to the Railway Labor Act. In 1936, Congress amended the RLA to make it so it applied to airlines, not just railroads. And you can kind of see why that made sense from Congress's perspective. Just like railroads, airlines are these supercritical arteries within the greater body of the American economy. Just like railroads, if a bunch of airline workers suddenly went on strike, the nation's economy would start to shit itself. So if you're an airline worker, all this stuff about craft unions and presidential emergency boards and being largely unable to strike applies to you too. Third, a super funny and really interesting side effect of the RLA applying to airlines is that it may also apply to spaceships, like companies that are all about traveling to space. That's because the RLA technically applies to, quote, common carriers by air, which at the time the law was written obviously referred only to airplanes because that's all that existed. But you know what other kind of business activity, by definition, is all about transporting people and cargo through the air? That's right, space travel. There's recently been this fascinating series of cases where Elon Musk's SpaceX has argued that it's subject to the RLA because it is essentially a common carrier by air. This is an evolving area of law, so unclear how things might turn out, but it's funny to think of a bunch of astronauts being regulated by a federal law with the word railroad in its name. So that's RLA unions. Now we come to arguably the biggest, most famous, and most common form of union, the one that covers all parts of the American private sector that aren't railroads or airlines or agriculture or quote-unquote domestic servants. I'll tell you right now that most of our conversation about localism and organized labor is going to center on this kind of union. That's not because they're more important or more worthy than other kinds of unions. It's just because if you're listening to this, it's most likely that this kind of organized labor is most applicable to you because most people work in sectors that aren't government or agriculture or railroads or airplanes or domestic servitude. Horrible term. So I'm going to be spending a bit of time and attention here that I won't be giving to other unions. Let's start by naming this category because the unions with people who don't work in government or agriculture or railroads or airplanes or domestic servitude doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. The law covering these kinds of unions is the National Labor Relations Act, or the NLRA for short. Accordingly, we'll call these kinds of unions NLRA unions. More acronyms, yay! The story of the NLRA is both similar and different to its sister law, the RLA. It may not shock you, but it turns out that labor strife was not restricted to just railroads back in the 1900s. There were a bunch of devastating, violent, and disruptive strikes all across the private sector, including stuff like the coal strikes in Pennsylvania in 1902 and the New York shirtwaist factory strikes in 1909. The Industrial Revolution and the changes in the American workforce it caused, combined with the increased presence and militancy of unions, meant that labor clashes were becoming more common and more costly. Kind of like the RLA, the can got kicked down the road a bit around the First World War because Wilson convened a labor board and nationalized certain industries, and also kind of like the RLA, there was a series of pre-NLRA labor laws that passed after World War I that for one reason or another didn't stick. But when the NLRA finally did get passed in 1935, there were some very important differences in the context in which it was passed, and the differences in that context make the NLRA in many ways a much murkier and more ambiguous to interpret law than the RLA. Let's not ignore the elephant in the room. 1935 was a very particular time in America. We were in the throes of the Great Depression, and union activity always tends to increase when the economy is doing poorly. There's no point in striking if your boss is paying you enough and you're happy with your job, right? And both that shit goes right out the window as soon as the boss has to start pinching pennies. The man in office at this time was none other than one Franklin Delano Roosevelt, serving the first of what would become 4 terms. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that FDR completely overhauled how the American federal government worked, altering the relationship between Americans and the feds in ways that we're still feeling today. You might have heard of FDR's political program before. It's what progressives praise and conservatives, or at least the more traditional ones, curse as the New Deal. The New Deal's whole MO was creating big-ass federal administrative agencies to manage big portions of the economy and try and pull America out of its economic slump. These big administrations include such bangers as the FDIC, which still insures your bank deposits, the SEC, which regulates the stock market, the FLSA, which sets out minimum wage and bans child labor and also creates the 40-hour work week, the SSA, which administered the new Social Security system that is now one of the most sacrosanct areas in American politics, and, last but not least, creating something called the National Labor Relations Board, which was the administrative agency in charge of enforcing the National Labor Relations Act. You might notice that all these New Deal laws and agencies weren't exactly pro-business and seemed to be more concerned with helping out average people rather than serving business interests. I can guarantee you that companies were frothing at the mouth at the time at the concept of a minimum wage. And it's certainly undeniable that the NLRA was part of this bundle of laws and agencies. That would tend to make it more likely to be different in focus and intent than the RLA, which is passed pre-Depression during the Roaring Twenties under the conservative pro-business Coolidge administration. Conservatives hated the NLRA and basically understood it to be a piece of socialist legislation. But the story doesn't stop there. Like the RLA, the NLRA was amended in important respects in the decades following its passage. Of particular importance, the NLRA was amended in 1947 via the Labor Management Relations Act, which I'm just going to start calling the LMRA. It's like the 50th acronym, but I promise you don't want to hear me say Labor Management Relations Act like 20 times in the upcoming paragraphs. The LMRA made the NLRA less favorable to unions by adding new labor law violations that applied to unions rather than employers, and banning powerful labor practices like secondary boycotts and secondary picketing, which is where a union encourages people not to do business with a particular company because that company does business with another company that's in a labor dispute. It also outlawed solidarity strikes, which is where a union goes on strike to support another union strike directed at a different company. Hilariously, the LMRA actually required certain union people to sign affidavits saying they weren't communists, though that particular requirement got taken out behind the shed for obvious First Amendment reasons. And another particularly important part of the LMRA was a section under which, kind of like the RLA, the president was empowered to intervene in labor disputes that could hugely impact the American economy and could make the parties sit down to negotiate, and if things went south, could get a federal court injunction to suspend all striking or lockouts for 80 days. As you can see, this law does not give Congress the power to impose contract terms, so it is less powerful than the RLA in that respect. The injunction also can last for only 80 days, whereas I'm pretty sure that the RLA allows railroad union strikes to be permanently enjoined. For certain other reasons about NLRA unions we'll get into in a bit, most labor controversies involving NLRA unions don't implicate the whole American economy, and so the president usually doesn't have a basis to interfere, meaning that this power isn't quite as relevant in the NLRA context as it is in the RLA context. The point is that the Labor Management Relations Act has so fundamentally changed the NLRA that it was and is an entirely different law, one with a hard conservative streak cutting through the original liberal pro-labor and pro-worker squishiness. These contradictions in purpose and political influence are apparent in the text of the NLRA itself. The NLRA actually describes its purposes and what it is trying to achieve in the text of the law. It just kind of describes it in two separate sections and in two conflicting ways, with the second section being added in by the conservative amendments passed as the LMRA. Let's start with the first purposes section, which is quite long and also quite beautiful to a lefty like me, so I'm just going to read the whole thing to you. Quote, "The denial by some employers of the right of employees to organize and the refusal by some employers to accept the procedure of collective bargaining lead to strikes and other forms of industrial strife or unrest, which have the intent or the necessary effect of burdening or obstructing commerce by A. impairing the efficiency, safety, or operation of the instrumentalities of commerce, B. occurring in the current of commerce, C. materially affecting, restraining, or controlling the flow of raw materials or manufactured or processed goods from or into the channels of commerce, or the prices of such materials or goods in commerce, or D. causing diminution of employment and wages in such volume as substantially to impair or disrupt the market for goods flowing from or into the channels of commerce. The inequality of bargaining power between employees who do not possess full freedom of association or actual liberty of contract and employers who are organized in the corporate or other forms of ownership association substantially burdens and affects the flow of commerce, and tends to aggravate recurrent business depressions by depressing wage rates and the purchasing power of wage earners in industry and by preventing the stabilization of competitive wage rates and working conditions within and between industries. Experience has provided that protection by law of the right of employees to organize and bargain collectively safeguards commerce from injury, impairment, or interruption, and promotes the flow of commerce by removing certain recognized sources of industrial strife and unrest, by encouraging practices fundamental to the friendly adjustment of industrial disputes arising out of differences as to wages, hours, or other working conditions, and by restoring equality of bargaining power between employers and employees. Experience has further demonstrated that certain practices by some labor organizations, their officers, and members have the intent or the necessary effect of burdening or obstructing commerce by preventing the free flow of goods in such commerce through strikes and other forms of industrial unrest, or through concerted activities which impair the interests of the public in the free flow of such commerce. The elimination of such practices is a necessary condition to the assurance of the rights herein guaranteed. It is declared to be the policy of the United States to eliminate the causes of certain substantial obstructions of the free flow of commerce, and to mitigate and eliminate those obstructions when they have occurred by encouraging the practice and procedure of collective bargaining, and by protecting the exercise by workers of full freedom of association, self-organization, and designation of representatives of their own choosing, for the purpose of negotiating the terms and conditions of their employment or other mutual aid or protection." End quote. A few takeaways here. It's noteworthy that the section begins by straight up saying, hey, all these fucking employers aren't letting their employees unionize, that's pretty fucked up. And it follows by straight up saying that there is an inequality of bargaining power between employees and employers absent some protection of the right to organize. This all reads like a signpost that the NLRA is really about these liberal objectives of empowering unions and workers. Now, it's certainly interesting that other of the language here instead dresses the NLRA as basically a keep the gears turning piece of legislation, one that prioritizes industrial peace and a profitable American economy, and just sees giving unions some rights as one way to accomplish that. That's all the stuff about keeping the channels of commerce or the flow of commerce open. But it really does feel like a window dressing of economic respectability rather than a truly central goal. Thus, the focus on increasing wage rates and restoring equality of bargaining power and avoiding the diminution of employment and wages. The real kicker is the final paragraph that the official policy in the entire United States is, quote, encouraging the practice and procedure of collective bargaining and protecting the exercise by workers of full freedom of association, self-organization, and designation of representatives of their own choosing. The policy isn't keep the factories online. It's protect workers' rights to unionize and then encourage the practice of bargaining with those unions. But then later, we get the following purposes section for the NLRA, this one that came in by amendment with the Labor Management Relations Act. Industrial strife which interferes with the normal flow of commerce and with the full production of articles and commodities for commerce can be avoided or substantially minimized if employers, employees, and labor organizations each recognize under law one another's legitimate rights in their relations with each other, and above all recognize under law that neither party has any right in its relations with any other to engage in acts or practices which jeopardize the public health, safety, or interest. It is the purpose and policy of this act, in order to promote the full flow of commerce, to prescribe the legitimate rights of both employees and employers in their relations affecting commerce, to provide orderly and peaceful procedures in preventing the interference by either with the legitimate rights of the other, to protect the rights of individual employees in their relations with labor organizations whose activities affect commerce, to define and prescribe practices on the part of labor and management which affect commerce and are inimical to the general welfare, and to protect the rights of the public in connection with labor disputes affecting commerce. End quote. Where'd all that stuff about workers' rights and bargaining inequalities and depressed wages go? All of a sudden, the only thing we care about is avoiding industrial strife and keeping the flow of commerce up. And there's tons of coded language in here that basically says, fuck you, unions, stop going on strike so much and doing all these very annoying things that keep people from making money and people from buying products. So unions, no engaging in acts or practices which jeopardize the public health, safety, or interest. And let's make sure that when management and workers disagree on something, we resolve that through orderly and peaceful procedures for preventing the interference by either with the legitimate rights of the other. Like the first purposes section, the second section really underscores its point at the end, while telling us that the purpose of the NLRA is to protect the rights of the public in connection with labor disputes affecting commerce. The purposes section added by the LMRA makes the argument that the NLRA is really about making sure we don't hurt the public, by giving unions the inconvenient power to boycott or strike too much. And by the public, we of course mean little Timmy, who might not be able to get his Labubu because it's stuck on a ship due to a dock workers' strike. The public also includes presumably business owners and shareholders. This purposes section asks, won't somebody think of the shareholders? When I teed up our conversation on the RLA, I started by confidently saying this is the purpose of the RLA, this is what it's about, to keep the trains running and not to empower workers. I can't really make such a confident proclamation here. The purposes of the NLRA as it currently exists are still arguably an open question. The internal tension of the NLRA remains unresolved. Is the NLRA ultimately a law about empowering workers to organize and bargain collectively, even if that cuts into business interests' pockets? Or is it ultimately a stabilizing law meant to limit the scope of labor activity, reduce how often strikes happen, stop rocks from being thrown through factory windows and punish the throwers, and keep the gears of American commerce moving and profitable? Keep this question, the uncertain purposes and policies that the NLRA is supposed to achieve, and the tension within the NLRA itself, in mind as we move forward. Alright, after that very long preamble, let's get down to brass tacks and answer the three important questions that we also answered when we were talking about the RLA. Who does the NLRA apply to? What kind of bargaining system does it set out? And in what situation does it allow the covered employees to strike? Starting with the first question, as mentioned earlier, the NLRA covers workers and unions within the private sector, but there are specific carve-out areas where the NLRA does not reach. Two of those carve-outs are the railroad and airline, and maybe soon spaceship industries, because those industries are covered by the RLA. But the NLRA also does not cover agricultural workers, or, sorry, I keep saying this, but it is a term the NLRA itself uses, those engaged in domestic service. Is that because they're covered by other federal labor laws? No. The reason why is pretty simple and also pretty damn unfortunate. Basically, the Democratic Party and the overall political coalition that passed the NLRA hadn't undergone the political realignment that would occur decades later in terms of race. The South was still a Democrat stronghold, and the Democrats as a whole were full of the white working class voters that nowadays have become the most solid part of the Republican base. Today, we're pretty used to progressive economic positions being paired with progressive racial outlooks, but that was not always the case in American history. To pass the NLRA, and indeed a bunch of other pieces of New Deal legislation, these Southern Democrat politicians needed to sign on. And these politicians wanted to protect the interests of white working class voters, not other groups. Let me not dance around this anymore. You know why the NLRA doesn't give organizing rights to agricultural and domestic workers? Because in the 1930s, most of the people who worked in those industries were black or not white. And Southern politicians didn't want to increase the wages of black people or otherwise grant them rights that would change their place in society or give them the ability to leave exploitative Southern economic arrangements. That's literally the whole reason. We actually see the same or similar exclusions in other pieces of New Deal law, including the Social Security Act and parts of the Fair Labor Standards Act. This is maybe the darkest and most abominable part of the NLRA, that it excludes huge groups of workers from receiving labor rights for no damn good reason except that they happen to have the wrong color of skin during Jim Crow. Despite some attempts over the years to add these workers back in, there's never been any real traction, at least at the federal level. Stay tuned, we'll be turning to these groups of workers later when we talk about state private sector unions. So that's the NLRA coverage, all private sector workers minus railroads and airlines and agriculture and domestic workers. But because things are never simple, a few last little asterisks here. First, in addition to not covering railway, airline, agricultural, and domestic workers in the private sector, the NLRA also doesn't cover anyone employed by their parent or spouse. That basically never comes up. People don't usually get into union disputes with their dads or their wives in the rare instance that either of those people are their boss, but I thought I'd bring it up for completeness' sake. Second, although the NLRA generally applies only to the private sector, there is at least one pretty notable exception, the Postal Service. That's due to the 1970 Postal Reorganization Act, which, among other things, made so that Postal Service workers were covered by the NLRA. However, the Postal Reorganization Act specifically says that postal workers are not permitted to strike, so the NLRA's effect on them is a bit neutered in the sense that they don't have the most powerful tool that's available to other NLRA workers and unions. Moving on, what system of bargaining does the NLRA set out? Thanks to the vocabulary we developed in our RLA discussion, we can now confidently say that the NLRA sets out a system of enterprise bargaining. If you remember, that means that unions are organized on a business-by-business, shop-by-shop, enterprise-by-enterprise basis, rather than nationally across job roles or industries. The way you get a union into or out of your workplace under the NLRA is kind of similar to how it works under the RLA. First, you need to make an appropriate showing of interest, though under the NLRA, you only need to have 30% of employees in the unit sign cards, rather than 50% like under the RLA. However, I will say that it would probably be a pretty poor tactical decision to try and get an election with just 30% of people signing authorization cards, because if you can only get 30% of people to agree they want a union to come in, how do you know you're actually going to win when that election happens? Anyway, you only need 30%, but whatever percent you have that's either 30 or more, you then submit a petition to the NLRB, who then schedules a secret ballot election. Unlike the NMB, the NLRB's elections are overwhelmingly conducted in person on a single scheduled day, with the ballot box and ballot count usually both located within the workplace. So you have to show up and vote under your boss's watchful eye, though he won't know whether you voted for or against. That's because your ballot is a secret. However, if your boss sees you show up and vote, and then the union wins, he at least knows you more likely than not voted for the union, and that can be a bit scary. Anyway, if a majority of votes are in favor of unionization, then the union comes in. If there's a tie or a majority against unionization, then the union doesn't come in. That leaves just the question of how and when the NLRA allows workers to go on strike. In general, the NLRA gives unions and even non-unionized employees a significantly stronger right to strike than the RLA. Except for the relatively rare instance where the president intervenes because a potential strike could fuck up the whole economy, which doesn't happen very often. If your local Starbucks goes on strike, that doesn't really have national economic implications. There is no way the feds can step in to stop a strike. There also generally isn't the need to go through a whole process requiring mediation and cooling off period before you're allowed to strike under the NLRA. Instead, whether or not you can strike simply depends on what the purpose of your strike is. The NLRA recognizes two categories of legal purpose for a strike. First, you can strike to protest something called an unfair labor practice, which is basically protesting when your employer does something that the NLRA bans in terms of discriminating against people based on them exercising their rights under the Act. That means either being pro-union or being against union. For example, suppose your employer learns that you're a pro-union person and fires you because of that. That's a big no-no under the NLRA, so your friends at work say, hey, until you rehire our buddy you fired, we're going to go on strike. The NLRA says, yeah, that's okay. No mediation, no cooling off, go ahead and go on strike. Notably, if this is the reason you're on strike, then your employer is not allowed to hire permanent replacements for the strikers. When the strike ends, the employer has to get rid of any replacements it hired and let you have your job back. But that only applies to ULP strikes. The second purpose that you can legally strike for is to try and get an economic concession at the bargaining table. So if your union and your employer are bargaining over a contract and your employer is refusing to give way on your amount of paid sick leave, then you and your fellow employees can go on strike and pressure the employer to grant that benefit. However, in these economic strikes, the employer is permitted to permanently replace you, and you aren't guaranteed your job back once the strike is over. On the flip side, if you strike for reasons that aren't unfair labor practice strikes or economic bargaining concession strikes, then your purpose is unlawful and the strike isn't protected. A non-exhaustive list of illegal purposes to strike under the NLRA include supporting a union's unfair labor practice. So like if a union goes out and somehow does something unlawful under the act, say like beat somebody up because they aren't in favor of the union, and then the union gets in trouble, you can't go on strike and picket to support the fact that the union did something illegal. You also can't try to compel the employer to do something unlawful through a strike. So, for example, you can't go on strike and say, until you, union, fire this really anti-union employee that's working alongside us, we're going to go on strike. You also can't strike or picket an employer because it does business with a second employer that your union doesn't like. That's all that no secondary boycott, strike, picket stuff the LMRA added in. Finally, and very importantly, a strike with a legal purpose can still be unlawful if it is done at an inappropriate time. If a collective bargaining agreement has a no strike clause in it, which is a clause where the union promises, hey, our employees won't go on strike while this contract is in effect, then it's illegal for the union to go on strike, and any worker who does it is not protected by the NLRA. The overwhelming majority of collective bargaining agreements have no strike provisions. They are always management's number one ask. Arguably the heart of every collective bargaining agreement is the union promising, hey, we're not going to go on strike during the time of the contract, and the employer promising from now on any disciplinary measures are going to be subject to grievance procedures. As a result, this inability to go on strike, if you have a no strike clause in your CBA, is a super serious restriction that workers and unions ignore at their peril. In conclusion, the NLRA is generally more worker and union friendly than the RLA. It places significantly less burdens on the right to strike, it requires a lower initial showing in order to obtain a union election, and it provides much fewer avenues for the feds to jump into labor disputes, including the absolute lack of any ability to impose contract terms on a union. However, it would be an exaggeration to say that the NLRA is a font of pro-worker and pro-union support from the federal government. For one, the very purposes the NLRA is supposed to achieve are themselves a muddled mess, with an initial goal of bolstering working bargaining power being tempered by later amendments to the NLRA that came in through the LMRA that saw the law as instead tamping down on unions' ability to strike or do other stuff that is disruptive to the economy and to businesses' profits. For another, the NLRA does not provide protections for agricultural or domestic workers for no other reason than the stupid racism of the people who passed the law in the 30s. And finally, the NLRA prevents secondary strike / boycott / picketing tactics that otherwise could provide a very potent tool for unions to put pressure on employers. But overall, it would be hard to deny that the NLRA lays out a skeleton of some pretty potent rights for labor. But what about the flesh and muscle connecting those bones, the operations of the NLRB, the agency that enforces the NLRA, the efficiency and speed with which the NLRB is able to enforce the law that it's charged with enforcing? Well, stay tuned on that one and how that question applies to all the other laws and agencies we're discussing in this episode. For our third and most difficult to explain category of union, we have public sector unions. As I mentioned before, public sector unions are further split into federal worker unions and state worker unions. We'll start with federal unions because they're easier to explain since they're covered by just one law. Federal worker unions are the new kid on the block when it comes to federal organized labor statutes. They're organized under the Federal Service Labor Management Relations Statute, so add FSLMR to our growing bouquet of lovely acronyms, which was passed in 1978 under the Carter administration. This technically was not the first time that federal employees were allowed to unionize. John F. Kennedy had issued an executive order in 1962 that provided for federal unions with limited bargaining authority, but the 1978 FSLMR formalized and solidified that arrangement, and also created the Federal Labor Relations Authority as the agency in charge of administering the FSLMR. And with due respect to any federal government workers who happen to be listening to this, sorry. Federal unions are kind of weak as shit in terms of how much power they have, so we aren't going to spend a ton of time on them. But let's go through the same 3 questions we answered for the other union schemes and then turn to some, let's say, unfortunate current events for federal unions. Who does the FSLMR cover? What kind of representation scheme does it set out? And what kinds of rights to strike does it provide? As for who the FSLMR applies to, it's federal workers, but not all federal workers. Specifically, it's employees of federal agencies that are covered, but not all federal agencies. First, nobody in the Army gets an FSLMR union. Second, the following agencies are specifically excluded from FSLMR coverage as stated in the statute itself: the GAO, FBI, CIA, NSA, TVA, FLRA itself, very funny, FSIP, and the Secret Service. Oh, and tucked away in the statute is something that says the president can issue an order excluding any agency from being covered by the FSLMR if the president determines that applying the FSLMR to that agency, quote, in a manner consistent with national security requirements and considerations, is impossible. Now what kind of president would do such a thing? Moving on, what kind of representation scheme does the FSLMR set out? Well, it wouldn't really be correct to say enterprise bargaining because, after all, these agencies are all part of the same employer, quote-unquote, the federal government. But that's probably the best analogy here, more or less. Unionization is on an agency-by-agency basis rather than, say, all agencies that have to do with a particular agency or all federal lawyers. And sometimes different parts of the same agency can even be represented by different unions and or have different bargaining units. So if you squint and say that each agency is basically like its own factory or company or whatever, it's kind of like enterprise bargaining. Honestly, as we'll continue to see when we're talking about these public sector unions, it's kind of difficult to map the enterprise versus craft versus sectoral distinction onto the federal and state governments because they're such unique beasts. As for how you get people into a union or bring a union in or out of an agency, stop me if you've heard this one before. You get 30% of people in the union to sign cards, and then the FLRA holds an election. The election might be held on-site at the workplace, or by mail, or through the internet or telephone. If a majority of workers vote in favor of the union, then the union comes in. If it's a tie or more people voted against the union, then the union doesn't come in. Yeah, a lot of the FSLMR and the agency it created, the FLRA, were kind of patterned after the NLRA and the NLRB. That just leaves us with how federal unions can strike. Except, oops, trick question. Federal workers can't strike, unionized or otherwise. The FSLMR straight out takes away the most powerful tool available for unions by specifically saying nobody's allowed to go on strike. And while it's in the neighborhood, it also says that federal unions aren't allowed to bargain over wages, hours, or benefits. You know, all the shit that actually matters that presumably you would want a union around to help you negotiate. Neat. Also, no picketing allowed that would disrupt ordinary agency function. The thing federal unions are probably most known for, at least in this particular political moment, is getting blown the fuck out by Trump. Citing that authority under the FSLRM for the president to issue an order saying no unions in an agency if unionization is incompatible with national security, Trump has done just that for multiple agencies, including NASA, the U.S. Agency for Global Media, the Patent and Trademark Office, the National Weather Service, the VA, the DOJ, and about 20 other agencies. Bye-bye, unions. Tough. When the president can just wake up one day and go, yes, I don't think you guys have labor rights anymore. How strong is the FSLMR anyway? And even if the president doesn't do this, you don't get to bargain over wages or hours, and you aren't allowed to go on strike or picket. Really, this is why I'm saying the FSLMR is not super relevant when it comes to our discussion. In addition, any potential localist reforms we're going to discuss later on aren't going to apply to federal employee unions, and that's because Even in a localist America, where local governments have been given significantly more authority and self-rule ability, it kind of just makes sense that the feds should get to make the rules when it comes to their own employees, instead of like local governments somehow saying, hey, federal government, this is what you can and can't do with your own employees. So now we're going to come to the second category, the second branch of public sector unions, state public sector unions. This is where things get very difficult to summarize and explain. Each state handles public sector unions in their own special way. Because it's up to states what kind of organizing rights to give their employees, all state public sector unions are creations of state law rather than federal law. And just like other areas of state law, there is significant variation between the states on this topic. Some states outright disallow any kind of unions among state employees. Others allow unions only for certain kinds of professions, like firefighters or police. Still others simply have no state law about the issue at all, but may or may not have judicially created case law that gives some or all public employees the right to unionize or takes that right away from public employees. And other states kind of just kick the issue down to local governments and leave it to municipalities to make these decisions for themselves what kind of labor rights to give to city employees. Frankly, the differences between the states are so diverse and each state's procedures so individualized that we would need a whole series of episodes just to answer the three questions of who's covered, what kind of bargaining system is set out, and what kind of right to strike exists for the labor laws or lack thereof that apply to state employees in each state. All I can do now is try to point out a couple of trends in a really shallow manner. Starting with who's covered, the most common kind of state law public sector unions cover teachers, firefighters, and policemen. But there is significant variation even within that trend. Some states extend unionization rights to just police and firefighters, while others give them just to teachers. I frankly just don't really know where states draw the line in terms of whether low-level supervisors are generally allowed to be part of unions or not, but I suspect the answer shifts depending on the state. For what kind of bargaining system these various state laws set out for state employees, again, the governmental nature of these jobs makes it a bit difficult to assign the normal enterprise/craft/sectoral distinctions to them, and that's even before any potential state-level variations in the particular laws in question. I guess you could say it's kind of a limited sectoral system that's within the bounds of a single locality. Usually the same union will represent all the firemen in all stations across a locality, and it's the same for police. Thus, it's the firemen's union and the police union rather than a union for station number 12 and a different one for station number 13. And usually firemen and police will operate under the same shared contract regardless of where they happen to be stationed, assuming there's more than one station in where you live. As for the procedures on how to get a union into or out of one of these areas, not to sound like a broken record, but it's going to vary a lot depending on exactly where in the country and which state or city you're talking about. Most states do have some kind of election procedure that, like the NRA and RLA, is patterned on needing to get a certain percentage of people in the union to sign authorization cards, and then will usually have some kind of state agency that's in charge of holding a secret ballot election. Lastly, although the right to strike for public sector unions, again, varies, there is a general trend, though not all-encompassing trend, to limiting the ability of such unions to go on strike. This is generally justified on the grounds that, it's really bad if your house burns down, or there's murderers on the loose, or your kid isn't able to go to school. Much more important than if you can go to Starbucks and get a latte, or have a factory be producing a cell phone gizmo on any given day. Some would argue that it's precisely because these jobs are so vital that we should give the people in them the maximum ability to work collectively and improve their terms and conditions of employment, but the, quote, too important to strike rationale is the one that's most commonly offered. A brief note on the state subcategory of public union before we move on. Like federal unions, the application of state public sector unions is pretty limited. Most people listening aren't going to be working a job that would be organized in such a union. And that should be pretty clear by me repeating "it depends" about a billion different times. It's tough to give you guys super good information on this subject without going crazy into the weeds and going way off topic of the stuff that's going to be relevant for our discussion here. But I do think it's really important to flag that these unions exist in order to prep for our eventual pivot into discussing localist reforms in this area. Why? Well, arguably the work that the people in state public sector unions do is the most immediately important to you and your family and your friends and your neighbors than any other kind of work we've gone over thus far. The people in state unions teach your children. They keep you safe. They respond to emergencies. They make sure that utility lines stay up. Their role in your community and indeed across all of America is literally irreplaceable. And despite this importance, cities and counties, not the state or federal government, are in many places in America doing a good job of bargaining and navigating unionization on a community by community basis. I think there is an impulse in American political thought on both the left and the right that the more important a subject is, the higher level of government it should be handled by. So the very important shit should be left to the feds, the kind of important shit to the state government, and everything else to the local government. That's partially just because of how preemption works, and so we don't have much of a choice in many areas of law under the current American system. But it's also because we just kind of assume that the feds and the states are the most competent to handle the most weighty and serious political topics. Despite this, there are all kinds of crucially important areas that are in fact handled completely at the local level, and that local governments have been quietly taken care of for decades or even centuries. And if local governments are competent enough to handle such topics, why shouldn't they be competent enough to handle other ones that we instinctively turn to higher levels of government to manage, despite obvious dysfunction, delay, and capture by special interests? If your local government is competent enough to make decisions about how bargaining should work with teachers and emergency responders, the very jobs that keep our communities together, why do we automatically assume they aren't competent enough to determine how bargaining should work with steelworkers or baristas or nurses? Just a thought. Finally, we have a disparate group of unions that I'm calling state private sector unions. Just to be clear about what we're talking about here, when I say a state law private sector union, that is not the same thing as the state law public sector unions we just finished going over. Now, these two types of unions are sort of siblings because they are both creatures of state law versus federal law. It's state statutes that set out the bargaining system for state and municipal employees, and it's also state laws that set out the bargaining system for what I'm calling state law private sector unions. But the two are different both in their intent, the private versus public nature of the workers they cover, and the kind of industries they implicate. Before we get into the now famous 3 questions we've been asking about each kind of union we've discussed, I want to provide a brief overview of what private sector state law unions are and why they exist. In short, remember those racist holes in the NLRA that made it so agricultural and domestic workers don't get collective bargaining rights? State private sector unions fill in those gaps. They step into the space very deliberately left by the NLRA and provide their own state-level labor schemes instead. That means that state private sector unions are agricultural workers' unions and, in theory, domestic workers' unions, though the former are comparatively much more common than the latter. Starting with the agricultural workers' state law unions, the number you'll see when you Google what states allow agricultural workers to unionize is that there are currently 14 different states under which it is legal for agricultural workers to organize into unions. It's an interesting mix of states, not all of which are your typical liberal squishes. We have Arizona, California, Colorado, Hawaii, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Nebraska, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Washington, and Wisconsin. But this 14 states provide for agricultural unions neat and clean number disguises a lot of confusion, ambiguity, and variety. For one, in those states that have passed statutes that say some variation of, okay, agricultural workers can unionize, the systems those statutes set out may be very different from one another in terms of the procedures they set out and the protections they provide. For another, it's not even the case that in all states where agricultural unions are recognized, that recognition flows from an explicit statute. Instead, it may actually flow by implication from state constitutional provisions that provide a broader state constitutional right to organize into unions, except for when those broader, state constitutional right to unionize state constitutional provisions don't provide a right to agricultural unions. Take Florida, for instance. Article 1, Section 6 of the Florida Constitution provides that the right of employees by and through a labor organization to bargain collectively shall not be denied or abridged. That's pretty strong language. Despite this, at least according to the sources I was able to find, Florida is not a state that permits agricultural unions. Even more confusingly, sometimes agricultural unions will argue that a right to unionize comes not from a state constitutional provision that explicitly mentions workers or unionization, but instead from a provision that provides for rights such as freedom of association. Lastly, it's actually kind of tough to clearly define who is or isn't an agricultural worker, and sometimes the exact definition of such workers will vary state by state. You'll see the NLRB struggling with this question too when trying to figure out whether or not the NLRA provides jurisdiction over a particular worker. For example, say you work for a weed dispensary as a mechanic. Your whole job is fixing and maintaining the advanced machinery the company uses to grow weed. You don't ever pick or process plants, you don't water or otherwise take care of them. You are just the repair guy who ensures the pipes and timers and lights are working. Are you an agricultural worker or not? I think reasonable minds could agree that it's at least kind of a tricky question to answer. As for potential domestic workers unions, well, unfortunately, I'm not really aware of any states that explicitly provide labor law protections for domestic workers. By that I mean I'm not aware of any state where there's some sort of explicit recognition under state law that domestic workers unions have bargaining rights. That's unfortunate. Domestic workers have very difficult and important jobs. They often care for the elderly, the mentally ill, or other people who need extra help at home. Their work is no less dignified and no less crucial than that of a steel worker, and they deserve to have that dignity recognized in the law. But for now, it looks like there aren't any states that have stepped up to fill the hole left by the NLRA. Now, just because there aren't any particular legal protections for domestic workers unions doesn't mean they don't exist. That's a point that bears repeating. This episode is only about the kinds of legal protections that do or don't exist for different categories of unions. That's a very different question from what kind of unions are or aren't active. For most of this country's history, unions operated outside the confines of the law, advocating for workers even absent any kind of legal recognition or protection. So please don't take me saying something like, oh, there are no protected agricultural unions in Florida, or Florida doesn't allow agricultural unions, to mean that there are no agricultural unions in Florida. It just means that the law doesn't provide any protections for that kind of union in Florida, nothing more, nothing less. It is still possible to form an agricultural union and have it see success in states like Florida. It just might be more difficult, and you won't have any backup in the law. And indeed, we do see that there are organizations that function something like a union for domestic workers currently in existence in America, for example, the National Domestic Workers Alliance. There are also some attempts to try and improve the scope of rights for domestic workers generally, including the passage of state laws generally called Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights that provide protection in the areas of wage and overtime, paid time off, and protection from retaliation or discrimination. 12 states have passed such a law, and at least one state, New York, also studied the practicality of extending collective bargaining rights to domestic workers. As of now, though, my understanding is that collective bargaining rights remain largely out of reach for domestic workers at both the state and federal levels. My hope is that someday that will change, given how important domestic workers are and how crucial the work they do is. Alright, on to the three questions. Who is covered by these state private sector unions? Well, agricultural workers, whatever that means, and in theory but not in practice, domestic workers. What kind of bargaining system do the state laws set out? Say it with me, class. It depends. When there is a state statute at play, the laws tend to vary state by state, and when there isn't, then ad hoc bargaining practices may be shifting and indeterminate. To take one particularly notable example, California's Agricultural Labor Relations Act basically makes a state-level version of the NLRA system, except applying solely to agricultural workers. It creates a 5-member Agricultural Labor Relations Board and sets out an enterprise bargaining system backed up with secret ballot elections. Compare that to Colorado, where the very recent Agricultural Workers' Bill of Rights, passed in 2021, just kind of tacks agricultural organizing onto existing state agencies and laws that have previously existed, including Colorado's Labor Peace Act, a very interesting law that we just have no time to get into. Lastly, those states that do provide legal protections for agricultural unions provide varying levels of protection for the right to strike. Some do permit strikes, some don't permit strikes, some permit strikes only after a notice and cooling off period and attempt at mediation, RLA style, and some prohibit strikes only during certain times of the year. For example, Kansas's relevant statute prohibits agricultural workers from striking, quote, during periods of marketing of livestock or during a critical period of production or harvesting of crops. Interestingly, state laws may actually provide more rights as to striking than federal laws on occasion. For example, California's Agricultural Labor Relations Act actually permits unions to engage in secondary boycotts and picketing and strikes, something the NLRA expressly forbids. So there we have it. If you want to unionize or get a union out of your workplace, under the current status of organized labor, all you have to do is figure out which of 4 or more different labor schemes you fit into, and then figure out which alphabet soup state or federal agency is in charge of administering that scheme, and then figure out the specific arcane procedures that apply to whatever it is you're trying to do with your agency of choice. What could be easier, right? But don't worry, it gets even worse. Because the whole time we've been talking about this stuff, I've been saying, oh yeah, this law covers so-and-so workers, and this law covers so-and-so workers. But I never actually defined what a worker is. What makes somebody a worker? Or more specifically, what makes somebody an employee, which is the type of worker that's protected by these federal and other state laws. Because spoiler alert, it isn't just working for an employer. No, it turns out that for the RLA or NLRA or the mishmash of other public sector laws to apply to you, you need to meet a very specific definition of worker, one that requires you to have an equally specific kind of legal relationship with the person that's paying your paychecks. In fact, this definition of worker is so specific that many modern employers have gotten smart and structured their employment structures in such a way that almost none of the people who work for them are considered quote-unquote workers. Let's get into why. Just as a caveat, I note that we're about to paint with a pretty broad brush here and ignore some important differences between how each American labor law defines worker or employee. The definition that each law uses is so technical that we could spend a whole lot of time just trying to tease each definition out and then comparing them to one another. I'm going to try and give you the general contours of how employee is defined under these laws with a bit of a bias towards the NLRA because that's probably going to be the most relevant to most of the audience. So take all this shit with a grain of salt, an even bigger grain of salt than you've already been taking throughout the rest of this episode. With that out of the way, we can move on. To vastly oversimplify, if you work for somebody or some company, you can have one of two kinds of legal relationship with them. You can either be an employee, in other words, somebody covered by all these labor laws and thus somebody with certain rights, or something called an independent contractor, under which you aren't considered an employee and thus don't have labor rights. Your natural question after this is probably, okay, thanks, Bluentschli, very helpful. What's the difference between an independent contractor and an employee? Answer, more or less nobody knows. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration. The actual answer is that the definition of an independent contractor is super unclear and also manages to change all the fucking time, depending on what political party happens to control the agencies that administer American labor law. Even more confusingly, there is also a distinction between independent contractors and employees in other contexts. The IRS recognizes differences in these categories when it comes to figuring out what kind of taxes someone needs to pay, and the Department of Labor, which, in truly a stroke of American genius, only something the American federal government could accomplish, actually is not in charge of American labor law, the NLRB is, and instead handles employment law stuff. Also uses the independent contractor-employee distinction when determining things like what workers have to be paid minimum wage. And get this, the definitions that the IRS and the Department of Labor use for independent contractor can be different from each other. And can also be different from the definitions used by federal and state labor laws, because the definition of independent contractor is relevant at the state level as well, because an independent contractor has to pay their own state unemployment taxes, whereas if you're an employee, then your employer has to pay those taxes. But putting all that bullshit aside, here's maybe the best I can do in trying to provide a whiff of how to define an independent contractor versus a worker/employee. The whole idea of an independent contractor is somebody who basically employs themselves. They then contract out their particular services, whatever those may be, to another entity. Here's an example I hope is helpful. Think of construction work. Let's say there's a construction company that's building a home. We'll call this BuildCo. BuildCo handles framing itself, which is probably rare in the real life, but just assume for the sake of argument that's how it works here. BuildCo goes and finds people who are house framers and then says, hey, how would you like to work for BuildCo? Once a framer is hired, BuildCo provides them with their tools, their safety equipment, and BuildCo branded high-vis vests and helmets. BuildCo sets up their hours and decides how much leave they get or don't get. If a BuildCo employee is sick and they need to take the day off, they call BuildCo's HR line and let them know. So that's the framers. However, BuildCo does not handle HVAC stuff itself. They don't maintain staff for that. Instead, BuildCo has a separate guy for HVAC. This guy has his own van, his own tools, and his own safety equipment. When BuildCo does business with the HVAC guy, it isn't like, hey, you want to come work for us? Instead, it's, hey, we want to hire you to do work on this specific project. What are your terms? How much will you charge? What will your schedule be like? The HVAC guy and the BuildCo office type sit down and negotiate all this stuff. The HVAC guy doesn't deal with BuildCo's HR department. He buys all his materials and all the systems he installs and then charges them to BuildCo as part of the contract he signs with them. In this scenario, BuildCo's framers are probably BuildCo's employees, but the HVAC guy is probably an independent contractor. He doesn't have an employer-employee relationship with BuildCo, and so wouldn't be able to, let's say, join up with the framers and go on strike against BuildCo. But this is kind of an easy case. In practice, there's a lot of situations where it is a bit more fuzzy whether or not you are or aren't an independent contractor. Here's one that is a bit closer and is sort of based on a real-life issue. Let's say you're a delivery driver. You have your own van, you buy your own equipment like dollies and gloves and stuff. However, you only have one customer, Amazon. You signed a contract with Amazon that in no way styled itself as an employment contract. In fact, it might have even said somewhere in the fine print that you specifically are not an employee of Amazon. Amazon doesn't offer you any benefits, and it also doesn't require that you slap a big Amazon logo on the side of your van. However, it does issue you an Amazon branded vest and shirt, and part of your contract says you have to wear that stuff while on duty. In theory, you have no required hours. Amazon isn't going to cancel your contract if you simply decided not to deliver any packages for a couple of weeks. However, if you do want to do work, then you have to use an Amazon app to sign up for blocks of packages and arrive at an Amazon facility at an assigned time that you have no ability to challenge or negotiate. You then have to stay on your route for as long as Amazon says you have to and promise to deliver all of your packages before 9 p.m. You're responsible for handling your own self-employment taxes, and you're not alone. There's about 100 other people in your city who do the exact same kind of job under the exact same kind of contract with very little, if any, alteration in the terms of one driver's contract versus the other. You aren't paid a wage. Instead, you get paid a rate that's quoted to you for the block of packages that you choose to deliver. Lastly, the terms of your contract say that if you get caught harassing or threatening a customer, then Amazon can immediately terminate your contract. But you are allowed to appeal that decision through certain channels that are internal to Amazon. In this circumstance, are you an independent contractor or are you an employee of Amazon? The answer is, it's not super clear. The facts are based on Amazon's Flex program, which it bills as providing a kind of Uber driver-like experience for people who want to deliver packages. I don't think that we have had the NLRA or another federal agency or a federal court determinatively weigh on this issue yet. I could be wrong on this, though. There are a few state courts that have found, for the purposes of state unemployment taxes, that Amazon Flex drivers have been misclassified as independent contractors and are actually Amazon employees. But again, the definition of independent contractor used in that context may very well be different from the definition used in the federal or other context, and is probably different from the definition of independent contractor that applies to you where you live. I really don't feel comfortable giving an opinion one way or the other on this. You'd have to ask a lawyer. Point is, although in theory independent contractor and employee are these distinguishable categories, in practice the lines between them can get very blurry very quickly. Now, like I just said, this is a highly tricky area of the law, and you really should talk to a lawyer if knowing whether or not you're an independent contractor is important to you. But I'll at least mention the legal factors that the state and federal statutes tend to look at in this area. Basically, the issue comes down to a kind of economic realities test, a super fuzzy, multi-factor standard that's going to look at all kinds of things in the relationship between you and the person who employs and or contracts with you. This often takes the form of a super long test. For example, the test that I believe the NLRA uses is to ask about how the following factors are at play for any given worker. A, the extent of control which, by the agreement, the business may exercise over the details of the work. B, whether or not one employed is engaged in a distinct occupation or business. C, the kind of occupation with reference to whether in the locality the work is usually done under the direction of the employer or by a specialist without supervision. D, the skill required in the particular occupation. E, whether the employer or the workman supplies the instrumentalities, tools, and the place of work for the person doing the work. F, the length of time for which the person is employed. G, the method of payment, whether by the time or by the job. H, whether or not the work is a part of the regular business of the employer. I, whether or not the parties believe that they are creating the relation of employer and employed. And J, whether the principal is or is not in business. Fuck if I know what that last one means, but there you go. Of course, as I mentioned before, not only is this test different than the one that the RLA or a state agency or even another non-labor federal agency might use, it also isn't even a test that's been in place all that long. The NLRB said this is the standard now in 2023. Prior to that, in 2019, the NLRB had used a slightly different test that did kind of pull from the same factors, but emphasized that the most important question as to independent contractor status is whether a worker had, quote, entrepreneurial opportunity, basically the degree to which a worker could conduct business on their own and work for other businesses, rather than how much control a company might have over how a worker does work for that company while they're doing work. I think the language the relevant case used was that all the factors I just discussed had to be viewed through the prism of entrepreneurial opportunity, which, again, fuck if I know what that means. And even before 2019, the standard has shifted a lot. And bet your ass it's going to shift again. Good luck if you need to know whether you're allowed to be fired for talking about union stuff. At last, we seem to have the full picture of how the fuck to figure out when and how you can unionize and where you fit inside this complicated-ass American labor scheme. First, you have to look and see what kind of job you have. Are you in the public sector, private? Do you work for a railroad, a farm, a McDonald's? Second, match your particular job up with the right choice between like 3 or 4 different potential laws that cover you depending on what kind of job you have. Third, you navigate the complicated system of administrative courts and filing requirements and election procedures that applies under the correct law. Fourth, you take a look at the relationship between you and the person or company that's paying you and figure out if you're an employee or an independent contractor. And you just have to shrug your shoulders and eat shit if you're an independent contractor, because if you are, you have no labor rights. And if you mess any part of this up, then you have no recourse if your employer fires you for going on strike, or your boss sues you for going on strike, or if your employer closes down your entire plant or place of work in response to you guys unionizing. I mean, really, when things are this simple and straightforward and worker-friendly, why is it that unionization rates are falling? It's all just so basic and easy. And here's the best, by which I mean worst, part. The complexity and technicality and finickiness of all this shit may be bad, but it isn't even the thing that is hurting organized labor the most. No, on top of this lawyer's wet dream of a legal thicket, we have two other factors that are really just kicking unions and workers in the teeth. The first is a legal doctrine known as field preemption, sometimes called garment preemption in the context of the NLRA. The second is the sheer horrible slowness and inefficiency with which the federal and state labor regulators operate, a slowness and inefficiency that is about to get even worse thanks to recent developments in presidential action and the federal courts. Alright, editing Blunchley jumping in here. Sorry for the shit tier webcam quality mic. So as I was worried might happen at the beginning of the episode, this episode has started to run really long. It's like an hour and a half right now. Too long to be able to jam everything that I have recorded together into one episode. As a result, Localism and Organized Labor is going to be a two-parter. How exciting. This first half was sort of about explaining why you should care about organized union stuff, and then sketching the outline of all the American legal systems surrounding labor. Next episode is going to be about how all these systems are currently falling apart at the seams. We'll even get into what Localism has to do or offer when it comes to this whole mess. I mean, that's can't miss podcasting if I've ever heard it. So as always, call that motherfucking subscribe button and tune in next time for part 2 of Localism and Organized Labor. If that sounds interesting, please be sure to follow us on Spotify or on our YouTube channel at LocalistPod. That's Localist with a T, pod. If these long-form podcasts aren't really your thing, then we also do great 3-minute long YouTube shorts that give a more condensed version of the podcast episodes. And check us out on Blue Sky at localistpod.bluesky.social. Finally, if you have any questions or comments, send me an email at localistpod, again that's localist with a T, pod, @gmail.com. Catch you guys next time. A huge thank you to Kevin McLeod for letting me use the 2 songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.